Hello and welcome to By the Numbers, the series where we go through all of the classes in 2024 Dungeons & Dragons and compare them to what they were in 2014. We'll look at all the features and see what they add to our damage, our control, our durability, and our mental resistance. We'll create a build and analyze each of those aspects and see just how it stacks up in comparison to all the other classes. Today we're looking at the Paladin. It's the last of the martial classes, and once we're done with it, we'll stick that into our tier list and see where it stacks up compared to all of the other martial classes. And then we'll move on to casters. I'm interrupting this video to do a quick ad for myself. I'm really excited to share what I've been working on with all of you. It seems like there's been a big boom of tabletop games lately, and so I've wanted to play all of them. But as I dove further and further in, I've realized just how many there are out there. As I started watching reviews, I quickly became frustrated with them, because a lot of them were sponsored by the game and only said nice things about them. Or they didn't really tell you how the game plays or feels. I don't even think they played it themselves. You could watch one-shots or live streams and get that in extremely long content, but I wanted something more succinct. I wished someone would play all the games, break them down, and give an unbiased opinion on what they liked and didn't like about them in a succinct way. And I figured, if I want to play them all, why not do it myself? Also, I did want to shine light on all those indie creators that have amazing games, but not much reach. Maybe together we could create a friendly community where anybody can join in and be directed to the right game for them. And thus, Tabletop Trends was born, a collaboration between myself and Jeremy from Insight Check, a new channel where we guarantee we play every game that we review, and not just play them with the game designers themselves. And after, we interview them and ask them about certain aspects of their game and why they did that. We'll share what makes them special, how to play them, including snippets from our own session, but also our own honest opinions on what we liked and didn't like and who we think would love this game. Because we believe there's a table out there for every game, and a game for every table. We're starting out with a strong lineup of 3 reviews: Indominant, Nimble 5e, and DC 20. Follow the link below to check them out, and join our Discord to discuss them. Now, back to the video. Paladins in 2014 were in a very solid place. They're a well-beloved class with very well-rounded features. In 2024, they saw a mixed bag of things with some buffs and some nerfs. And maybe most importantly, where do smites line up? And how do they compare one with another? We're going to look at all of that today, so why don't we jump right into it? At level 1, Paladins now get spell casting. All in all, Paladins have a pretty good spell list. They have all their smites, lesser, greater restoration, cure wounds, aid, command, bless, aura of vitality, find steed, and so much more. Of course, the most used and popular spells of the Paladins are smite spells. In fact, in 2014, smite wasn't a spell, but now it is, and it's in line with all of the other smite spells. When you hit with a melee attack, you can expend this spell with a bonus action to do the smite. When this comes to the divine smite spell, there's no doubt this is a nerf. Previously, Nova damage and Paladins went hand in hand. When you thought of one, you just thought of the other, because they could smite on every attack. Now, since it's a spell and a bonus action, you can only do them once a turn. I think limiting it to once a turn may have been enough, but making it cost a bonus action makes the Paladin builds a little less versatile and very bonus action heavy. Of course, having it as a spell makes it counter-spellable, but I don't think that's a big issue, honestly. It does also cancel out the classic Paladin-Barbarian combo, which is quite good. But this is where we are, and it is mostly the same. I think the one benefit of it being a spell is that now it's in line with all the other smite spells, and players will actually look through their smite spells now, and maybe even use something other than just Divine Smite. I think that's a win. First, let's take a look at how much damage our Divine Smite does. Using a level 1 spell slot, the average damage you get from doing a Divine Smite is 9 damage. If it's a 4-round encounter, we can divide that by 4 to get a 2.3 damage per round gain. We can see this increases as we use higher level spell slots. We're now going to go through all of the other smite spells and compare them and line them up so we can see just how much damage we'll gain from each one, and how much control we can gain from each one. Next up is Searing Smite. And this is a very good smite spell now. When you hit them, it does a d6 fire damage, and at the beginning of their next turn, they take another d6 fire damage. So it's a guaranteed 2d6, and then they make a constitution saving throw, and if they fail, they keep burning. So it's guaranteed for 2d6 and potentially get more on top of that. The nice thing is when you upcast it, it boosts the damage initially and on each of their turns too. So it's a guaranteed 2d6 at level 1 and a guaranteed 4d6 at level 2. Let's take a look at its chart. Here's the probability that they will stay on fire, and that has an additional 1 added to it because of the first turn. Here we can see the initial damage we get and also the secondary damage they'll take. Then the total and the damage per round. So using a first level spell slot, it's close to just using a Divine Smite, but a little bit better. As we go on, it becomes much stronger. So Searing Smite is kind of your go-to option if you want to deal damage. Now many monsters are resistant to fire damage, so that will drop this a ton. But a significant amount of the monsters that are fire resistant are actually undead or fiends. So you could just swap that for a Divine Smite and that'll do more damage then. Next up is Thunderous Smite. Also a level 1 spell. When you hit them, it'll send them flying 10 feet and knock them prone. Of course, they can make a strength save to resist that, but regardless, it'll do 2d6 damage anyway. Now I'm also going to measure the control we get from our smites. So here, Thunder Smite is the first spell that inflicts any control. For those of you who haven't seen my other videos, I have a way to measure control in a numerical way. You can take a look at this video here to see exactly how it works. But essentially, I take the unconscious condition, break it down into all of its sub-conditions, and I give unconscious the value of 100, and all the sub-conditions make up that 100. Then whenever you inflict those sub-conditions, you tally it up and you deal that much control. If you do 100 control per round, it's the equivalent of knocking one person unconscious per turn. Clear as mud. It's not perfect, but it does give a pretty decent idea of control. Okay, here's Thunderous Smite's table. Here's the probability that we push them and knock them prone. Here's the damage we get and the DPR gain. So the DPR is definitely lower, but we do get significant control. We get around 24 control points by doing a Thunderous Smite. Now that's not control per round because we didn't divide that by 4. Next up is Wrathful Smite. This is our last level 1 smite spell, and it's quite a good one. It's not as good as it was in 2014, but it's still quite good. It does 1d6 damage, and then they make a saving throw or they're frightened. Save ends. Here's the damage we get and DPR gain. It's pretty low, but if we look at the control, it's pretty decent. Here's the probability that they will fail a wisdom saving throw, and based on that, the number of rounds that they will be frightened. So based on monster saves, it kind of varies as we move up the levels, but we're around 25 to 30 control. The nice thing about this is there's a lot of ways to push people away. You can use a Warhammer with the push mastery, you can use shield bash, or you could use a reach weapon to just have some distance. Once they're frightened of you and not within melee, they can't close that gap. So I really like it. Next up is Shining Smite. This is a level 2 smite. It is our first and only good concentration smite. What it does is when you hit them, it's kind of like fairy fire. They start glowing and every attack against them has advantage. There's no save to prevent this. All you have to do is hit them. And that's really good. Legendary resistance can't affect it, so you stack it on this big bad guy, and for the rest of the encounter, everyone has advantage on all their attacks. That'll be a game changer. Now, when you hit them, it doesn't do the most damage then, but adding in the advantage and the extra damage you gain from that, just from you alone, becomes pretty significant. So if we use a longsword, here's our damage as normal, and here's how much damage we will do with advantage. Then we can see how much DPR gain we get. It's actually very close to Searing Smite. Of course, if you already have advantage, then this isn't that useful. I can see this one being used all the time. And here, giving all of our allies advantage gives us some control as well. The next one is a level 3 spell, Blinding Smite. This one, when you hit them, they are blinded, save ends. But that first turn, there is no save. They are just blinded when you hit them. And making someone blind is a fantastic condition to put on them, especially for casters, because so many spells require line of sight. Since the first turn of blindness has no saving throw, you can use this on casters with legendary resistance, and it's fantastic. Another reason that Vecna will hate paladins. So although it doesn't do the most damage off the bat, it will give a lot of debuff, and it generates advantage on attacks as well. Here we can see the number of turns we have blindness for, and how much control and damage that we will gain from this. Next up is Staggering Smite. It's a level 4 spell, and when you hit them, they are stunned if they fail a wisdom saving throw. And it's nice that it's wisdom and not constitution. Stunned is a fantastic condition. It totally destroys their turn. The control is pretty good, actually not as good as the blinded one, but this one's still good. And you'll probably use them on very different enemies in very different circumstances. Last up is Banishing Smite. And why, Wizards? Why? You took out every other instance where they had an HP number in the spell. At least I think you did. But you left it here in Banishing Smite. When you hit them, they have to have 50 or less HP, and they make a charisma save, and if they do all that, then they're banished. And banishing is great, but the cost here is just too high. I just can't see this ever being useful. Banishing, usually you want to do that at the start of an encounter, but monsters at this level have on average 230 HP. So if you've whittled them down to 50 HP, 1, it's probably not at the beginning of the encounter, and 2, you may as well just finish them there. Just don't even bother with this. I mean, it does the same amount of damage as an upcast Divine Smite, so you may as well cast this instead of that, I guess. But it does way less damage than a Searing Smite. Anyway, with all these stipulations, this is how much damage we do, and the amount of control we get. It's just so difficult to land it that the banish control is only this much. Now that is per turn, and banish is a concentration so it'll last a long time. So if you somehow land it on the first turn, you can multiply this by 4, I guess. Now let's take a look at a table with all of the smites lined up. This is the damage table. We can see that using a level 1 spell slot, Searing Smite is slightly higher than anything else. Then, at level 2, Shining Smite is actually the highest. But if you already have sources of advantage, then it's not going to do that much more. So Searing Smite is also a fantastic option. Using a level 3 spell slot, Searing Smite is now the highest, and Shining Smite is very close, and Blinding Smite's not too far behind. At level 4 and 5, Searing Smite and Shining Smite continue to be neck and neck. If we look at control, Wrathful Smite is a very solid control all the way up. But the highest control we can do, by quite a margin, is Blinding Smite. The blinded condition is great. The fact that you have it automatically on one turn and then save ends gives it a lot of good control. Of course, Staggering Smite is a harder control, so if you really need them locked down this turn, it's going to be a better option. But all in all, there's a reason to do pretty much every single one of these Smite spells, and I really hope that Paladin players will now use more of a variety of Smites. Alright, so those are the Smites. But what about Divine Favor? It's had a glow up since 2014, and now doesn't use concentration. It's a bonus action, so you cast it at the beginning of the encounter before you attack, and you have an additional d4 to all of your attacks for the encounter. Obviously, this is gonna be better if you have a paladin that does more attacks, like a 2-weapon fighting paladin. Let's look at these numbers though. At level 1, if we're not doing 2-weapon fighting, we have a 1.5 damage per round gain. And that actually is less damage per round than doing just a smite. Of course, once we get more attacks, that ends up doubling. If we use 2-weapon fighting with just the Nick property, that means we have 3 attacks, so it ends up being 5.25 damage. So that ends up being close to a level 4 smite. If you get even more attacks by using something like the Dual Wielder feat, which does require a bonus action, so there's some conflict there, but then you can deal even more damage. So Divine Favor is good. For a level 1 spell, it can be a good boost, especially if you can cast it before battle starts. It lasts for a minute, so if you can see it coming, just pump it on yourself. Now, although the damage per round may add up to a smite, the smite is done instantaneously, on one turn. And doing more damage now is better than spreading that out, so also something to consider. Then, once you have enough spell slots, the question's going to be, do I Divine Favor on my first turn so I can get that bonus damage, or should I smite my first turn with that big smite to have a bigger effect on the battlefield? It's going to be hard to balance that. So I think Divine Favor is going to be great at low levels. I think it can be useful at higher levels, it just becomes a little more difficult. Alright, I'm not going to go over all the spells that Paladins have, just these ones here. I want to move on next to Weapon Masteries. This is a new feature that Paladins get, along with pretty much every other martial out there. There are lots of good options here. Topple, Push, Sap, Nick, Slow, all these can be good options for a Paladin. I have a video here going over all the weapon masteries if you're interested, and how to use and combo them. Lay on Hands is a classic Paladin ability. Now it's a bonus action, so it's much easier to use in combat. Thanks for that. Unfortunately, yeah, it does conflict with Smites, but I'd rather it conflict with Smites than conflict with me attacking. Lay on Hands does scale pretty well with our level. Take a look at this chart here. We gain 5 HP per level into our pool. Here, I take one monster equal to our level, and if they attack us with all of their attacks on a turn, this is how much damage they will do on average. Then I compare that to our pool we have and see what percentage of that damage we can heal. And we can see that it's pretty consistent. It does fall slowly over time, but on average, it heals around 175% of the damage we take. It's not like it's world changing or anything like that, but it can definitely get you out of a tight spot. The next thing we get at level 2 is fighting styles, and here we can choose pretty much anything. Dueling, 2-weapon fighting, interception, protection, all of those are pretty great options for our paladin. Let's jump now to level 4 and take a look at the feats that would be interesting to a paladin. Great Weapon Master can be a fantastic feat. Sentinel, paladins are a protective kind of class, so that makes sense there. Following along those lines, Inspiring Leader can be a great one too. Give your allies a bunch of temp HP. But temp HP flows kind of freely in 2024, so maybe it's not as good. Shield Master can be a really great feat for a sword and board paladin. It can boost your control, it can boost your defense, and it can even boost your damage a little bit too. Mounted Combatant. This is a great feat for paladins because we're going to see in a second that they get a steed that they can always have with them basically. If you want to take advantage of that steed in combat, then the Mounted Combatant feat is kind of a no-brainer. It's kind of vital to protecting your mount, but also it can generate a lot of advantage for you too. And if you're going there, maybe take the Charger feat while you're at it too. That can add some extra damage or control. Lastly, there are some defensive feats you could take, something like Defensive Duelist if you're a 2-weapon fighting paladin, or Heavy Armor Master, which adds some damage resistance. That can help your paladin fulfill that tanky role you're looking for. Problem is, a standard build for a paladin is very mad, multiple ability score dependent. Typically, they're going to want to max their strength and get their charisma as high as they can go too, so it doesn't leave room for a lot of feats. If you want to max both, you can only pick one feat. Now, moving on to level 5. We get extra attack, of course, which is fantastic, but we also get Faithful Steed. This gives us the Find Steed spell once per day, cast for free. I do think it's a very common idea for a paladin to be mounted on a horse. That's kind of typical in fantasy. But in Dungeons and Dragons, I don't think you see it that much. Probably because it's kind of tedious to keep your mount around all the time. But if you do take advantage of this, mounts are very good, and this steed is even better. It only takes one action to cast, so even if it dies, you can resummon it in battle and hop back on. It heals when you do, has telepathy, and has a special action to frighten, teleport, or heal. If you upcast it to level 4, it can fly too. Alright, let me go over this for 1 second. It's a level 2 spell, just like the Misty Step spell. But this one boosts your speed from 30 to 60 feet, gives you a free disengage every turn, soaks up damage in combat, can potentially attack on its own, is an animal companion, and oh yeah, it can Misty Step too. That's a lot for a 2nd level spell. It's definitely powerful, cool, and iconic. I wonder if a lot of paladins will be small sized so they can mount medium creatures, making dungeon delving easier. Honestly, I don't really think this belongs as a paladin core feature. Not every paladin wants to be a horse rider, but it's strong and it's not my call. Let's move on to another iconic paladin feature, Aura of Protection. It gives everyone around you a bonus to their saving throws equal to your charisma modifier, all the time. It's fantastic. Obviously, this will boost our mental resistance a lot, but it's also going to boost our defenses as well, because we're more likely to succeed on our dex and our con saves to prevent damage. Take a look at this chart. This is how much our aura is boosting our resistance and how much damage we're preventing by having this aura active. At level 20, just by having this aura, it's preventing around 7 damage per round and boosting our resistance 25%. And it applies to anybody around you. It's a fantastic, fantastic feature. Moving on to level 9, we get Abjure Foes. This is a new feature that paladins get. You can expend a channel divinity to abjure foes around you. And oh boy, is this a fantastic use of your channel divinity. You can target a number of creatures equal to your charisma modifier. They become frightened for the duration, or until they take damage, and there's no additional saves. Also, they either have to choose an action, a bonus action, or a movement. Side note, they really should have kept that daze condition. But adding that together, it becomes a very strong control effect. Let's take a look at just how strong. We have about a 50% chance to succeed on abjuring a foe. So the average number of enemies we have is about 1.5. For our control, we frighten them and we limit their actions too. So if we say they have about a 50% chance to use their action and a 50% chance to move, this is how much control per round we're doing. That's 64 control per round at level 9, and it goes up to 95 at level 17. If you don't remember, that's basically the equivalent of knocking one person unconscious per round. This control is equivalent to very high level spells. Honestly, it's fantastic, and it feels so right. Everyone gathers around the Paladin, while they lift up their holy symbol, all the enemies around them freeze, and then you just pick off the enemies one by one. It can completely change an encounter. Just so good. And you can do this a lot of times a day. You have one channel divinity and you get an extra one later, but you replenish them on a short rest. So you could potentially do this like 3-4 times a day. Alright, moving on. At level 10, anyone in your aura is now immune to the frightened condition. A lot of creatures use frightened effects, so being completely immune to them is great. I'll be conservative and say that maybe 25% of the conditions we receive through our wisdom saves are going to be frightened. So this will boost our resistance a bit. At level 11, you get Radiant Strikes. Every time you hit with an attack, you deal an extra d8 damage, radiant damage, on top of that. It's a great way for paladins to get an extra damage bump when they need it. Aside from subclasses and spells, this is our last damage bump in the paladin class. At level 14, you get Restoring Touch. When you lay on hand somebody, you can expend 5 HP from that pool to heal pretty much any condition out there. It's like a bonus action greater restoration, and you can heal them a bunch on top of that. What can I say? It's great. At level 18, your aura expands to a 30-foot radius. Now, you're pretty much guaranteed to have all your party members covered by your aura. At level 19, we get a epic boon. The one they suggest here for paladins is Boon of True Sight. And while that is a fantastic option, it doesn't really do anything for our numbers. So I'll stick with it in our build, but just remember, this could be replaced with something that deals a lot more damage or gives some defense instead. Now that we've covered all the features of a paladin, let's take a look at a stereotypical paladin build. Now, I might get some heat for this, but even though Find Steed is part of the class, I'm just not going to put our person on a mount. This might seem unfair, but maybe we'll just summon it and use it to have a once per day free Misty Step or something like that. Or really, you can assume that you're mounted during this build. It doesn't make much of a difference. I'm just not going to take any of the control benefits of having a mount into account. In terms of weapon choice, I think there's lots of fantastic options for a paladin. 2-weapon fighting is a pretty good way. Of course, it'll conflict if you get the dual wielder feat, but with just Nick having 3 attacks, Divine Favor, Radiant Strikes, will be pretty good. Great Weapon Master, also a great choice for just tons of damage. Mounted with a lance is also pretty iconic, but for me, I'm going to choose Sword and Board. Just a longsword and a shield. I do want to say, out of all those options, Sword and Board is going to be the lowest damage dealer. So think about that as we're going through this build. And know that there are many builds of a paladin that are going to be much better damage dealers than this one. I'll also show just a pure damage dealing build and see how high it can get us. For our spells, I'll take the number of spells we have and divide it by 4 encounters per day. I'll also include that free Divine Smite we get as a level 1 spell. And we're only going to use Smite spells. Not Divine Smite per se, but only Smite spells. I'm going to spread out to choose different options all throughout our levels. Except for Banishing Smite, because it sucks. For feats, we're going to do Shield Master, because that's our thing. Otherwise, we're just going to bump our strength and our charisma. At level 1, we'll pick up the Sap Mastery, and for our spell, we'll use Thunderous Smite. At level 2, we'll pick up the Dueling Fighting style. I could really see the Protection style being a great pick, but since we have lower damage, I thought this might help us out a bit. Level 5, we get 2nd level spells. I'll use Shining Smite. This will generate advantage for us pretty much the rest of the fight. We can also knock people down with Shield Bash to generate advantage on our second hits. Between the two of them, I think we're going to have an advantage a lot. Once we hit level 9, we'll start using Searing Smite as our top level spell slot, and we're going to continue that way through the rest of our career. Even though we get great options like Abjure Foes and Lay on Hands, I'm not going to use them here. But just keep that in mind, that those are great ways to boost our control and our durability. However, by now, we're assuming that we can get 3 smites off an encounter. But that means if we go 2 or more turns without hitting at all, we won't be able to get those smites in. Hopefully that won't happen, but eventually we'll start using 4 smites in battle. And I will reduce the damage of the last one by 50% because I think there's a decent chance that we will have 1 turn where we miss on all of our attacks. So here you can see our damage per round that we do. I also calculate what I call combat space. This is the percentage of a deadly encounter that you will take out by yourself based on how much damage you're doing. It kind of just takes DPR and puts it into context. If that DPR turns into 50% of a deadly encounter, you know that's a lot of damage. So beside our DPR, I have our combat space, and we hope it goes generally kind of smooth. We're a little bumpy from level 1 to 5, but we even out. Between about 5 and 14, we're pretty close in terms of damage. It stays very stable, and a lot of that is due to smites as they scale up and we get more of them. But it does start to peter off in tier 4. Of course, if we grabbed a damaging epic boon, that would help us quite a bit in level 19 and 20, but we didn't. Honestly, if we were going to focus on damage, we wouldn't choose Sword and Board anyway. So if we average out our combat space over our entire career from level 1 to 20, we can take out 34.5% of a deadly encounter. Now, to put that into context, that is slightly higher than our rogue was. It's not terrible damage, but it's definitely not good damage. In fact, if you rank all the martials, it's second from the bottom. But wait, paladins aren't bad damage dealers. Do it again, do it right. Okay, fine. If you want to see a good damage dealing paladin, let's take a look. Great Weapon Master, and all of our smite spells are going to be dedicated to just Searing Smite. Take a look at the difference in these lines. Oh boy, that is a lot of damage. Tack on a damage dealing epic boon and it's even better. Averaging this paladin's damage out, we will take out 44% of a deadly encounter. That is right up there with the barbarian and the fighter. There you go. I hope you're happy. Paladins can do fantastic damage, but not sword and board paladins. They do okay damage, and that's honestly what we expect. Let's compare this to paladins in 2014. There's a couple levels where they deal a little bit more damage, and that's because they're divine smiting instead of thunderous smiting. But from level 5 on, paladins in 2024 are dealing more damage, and that's mainly due to our smite spells, Shining Smite and Searing Smite. Alright, now that damage is out of the way, let's take a look at control. Our build did a variety of smites, which each of them add control, but we also get additional control from Shield Bash and the Sap Mastery every turn. Also, our Aura of Protection grants bonuses to saves, and that is part of buffing, which is part of controlling. I'll assume 1 additional person until our aura expands, and then I'll assume 2 additional people. Also, we have immunity to Frightened, and that'll help boost our control as well. Around a third of all monsters have attacks that target our wisdom save, and like I said, we're going to estimate about 25% of those are Frightened. So I'm going to take the Frightened condition, divide it by a third, and then divide it by a quarter, and that's how much control we're going to add because we have immunity to Frightened. In higher levels, we can reach into the 50s for control per round, but if we wanted to, we could go much higher by using Abjure Foes and pure control smites. If we average this out through our entire career, we have a control per round of 36.3. That is pretty good for a martial. And unlike some martials, this control is purely buffs and debuffs, not mobility. And the debuffs are really heavy conditions like stunned and blinded. We aren't just pushing and tripping them. So paladins can do really good control, just as long as you're not only doing Divine Smite. Now let's move on to durability. What I do is I take a deadly encounter and have all of their attacks focused fire on us. Those incoming attacks will come in the form of AC attacks, but also attacks to our dex and our con, where we make saving throws for. What I do is I total up that damage, and I see how many rounds we could last based on how much damage we're taking. Paladins start out with pretty decent AC, so our durability is quite good at low levels. Shield Master boosts that a little bit, helping us deflect some of the dex damage, and then also Aura of Protection helps reduce that too by boosting our dex and con saves. For most of our career, we sail at around lasting 2 rounds, and that honestly is a pretty sturdy number. Let's move on to our last one, which is mental resistance. This is a measure of how much we can shrug off mental effects. What I do is I take 3 wisdom saves, see how likely we are to succeed on each and every one of them, and then average that out. I think we all know paladins are going to be fantastic here because of Aura of Protection. It doesn't just protect you, it protects everyone around you. Add in immunity to fear, and you become quite potent. If you average out the entire career, we end up at 62.8% resistance, and that is quite high. Don't take my word for it, let's take a look at how this compares with all of our other martial classes. Here's a graphic showing all the martials and their respective score in all of the dimensions we're looking at. We can see some excel in 1 or 2 areas, while some are kind of all-rounders. Combining this graph, we can see the overlap, but it's kind of hard to see which one's which. Let's take a look at our tier list. Paladin ends up second from the bottom in damage output, but like I said, there's ways to build up the Paladin to do fantastic damage. For control, Paladins are on top by a decent margin, at least until the casters come along. The Paladin turns out to be the martial controller, not the rogue. For durability, Paladins are second, tied neck and neck with Barbarians. Both are pretty tanky classes. For resistance, they take the top, but it's honestly pretty close to the fighter. And this really goes to show just how strong the fighter's Indomitable feature is. Close to matching the Paladin's Aura of Protection? Holy cow. Of course, they can only do it a limited number of times, while the Paladin can do it all day, every day, and share it. So there's that. I think the Paladin deserves #1 resistance. So Paladin ends up taking 2 of the top spots here for martials. Truly a strong class. And the thing I love about Paladins is all of these aspects can be boosted in some way by just making different choices in combat, not even a different build. You want more damage? Do more Searing Smite. Need more control? Abjure Foes. Need more durability? You can cast Shield of Faith or Lay on Hands. Scared of getting stunned by a bunch of Mind Flayers? You can use the Bless spell to improve all of your saves. It's a very versatile, strong, all-rounder. But that sums up the Paladin now. Thanks for joining me on this trip to look at all of the martials. It's been a lot of fun. Next week, I'm going to do a retrospective and look at this tier list and kind of sum it all up. Then it's on to casters. I hope to see you next time.